Hello, we're going to get started. First, I just want to welcome you today. I'm Lauren Griffith. I am the lead of the Hamilton Data Collection Site and the Associate Scientific Director of the CLSA. And more importantly, I want to thank all of you for your participation in our study because it's so critically important to everything that we do. So for today, the agenda is I'm going to do a short kind of introduction and update, let you know a little bit about what's happening with the data that you have so generously provided. And then we're going to have 3 talks on from researchers who are doing analyses with the CLSA data, so they'll talk a little bit about their areas. And then when I talked to my research coordinator, Julia, I said, what do you think it is that most people are really interested in? And she said, it's the biospecimens. So we're lucky enough to have Cynthia Balion, who is the director of the BBC, who will be doing a talk as well. And then the way that we're going to do this is we're going to each have about 15 minutes. So we'll go through all of the talks without questions, but then we'll get everyone up. So if you have any questions, just kind of jot them down, and at the end we'll have a Q&A, and I'll help facilitate that, and we'll have a microphone that's going to be going around. And one of the reasons that we have the microphone going around, we're so excited that so many people have come over. I think 230 people are here today, so that's fantastic. But we also are live streaming on Facebook and YouTube so that other people that are not able to come into the Innovation Park are able to see the presentations as well. And if there's something that you decide, oh, I really wanted to see that again, we will have it posted on the McMaster or the CLSA website. And I can pretty much guarantee that I, as a speaker, will not go and look it up again, but you are welcome to do that. So, let's see, whoops, I'm going the wrong way. So I'm going to just do a little bit of an update. And I think in terms of here, it's pretty, the whole question about why study aging, and I mean the simplest answer is that we are an aging society. And here's a snapshot from the Globe and Mail, but in the Spectator as well. In 2016, in the census, it's the first time that the number of people 65 and older is greater than the number of people that are 14 and younger. And this demographic shift is something that is going to be with the baby boomers, it's going to continue. And so it's actually projected that by 2026, that 1 in 5 Canadians will be 65 and older. And really, in terms of, there's many good things that happen with aging, but certainly there's other health challenges as well to the individual and the thinking that we need to do as a country to create policies that are going to allow us to age in the best way that we can. So, whoops. So I think we could agree that there's at least a few important goals and strategies that you'd have in a study on aging. And the first is to really think about how to promote healthy aging. And then again, to kind of minimize disabilities that are associated as we age. And to find better therapeutic approaches to conditions that disproportionately affect older adults or chronic conditions. And when I think of therapeutic approaches, we can really think of a spectrum. It's not just medications. It can be exercise. It can be, social interventions. It can be nutritional interventions. So thinking about it very broadly. But to really achieve these goals, we need to better understand the aging process. And we have really, really good data in Canada. Statistics Canada provides a lot of data on the population, but most of it is like snapshots, or what we call cross-sectional data. So we know very well how many people have different things, like say chronic conditions, and we know what they're associated with, but to really be able to look to see what sorts of trajectories are happening, how people are aging, what precedes the different outcomes that we're interested in, you need longitudinal data. And that's why we have the Canadian Longitudinal Study on Aging. And it's actually one of the largest studies of its kind in Canada, but it's also really internationally recognized as a very, very important study on aging. And I'll tell you some of the reasons why that is. The study is led by 3 principal investigators. The first to my left is Christina Wolfson. Dr. Wolfson's at McGill. To the far right is Dr. Susan Kirkland at Dalhousie. And in the middle, we actually have the lead principal investigator who is here at McMaster, Dr. Parminder Raina. And in terms of, to conduct a study like this, you can imagine that there's a lot of people that need to be involved. And so in addition to the PIs, there's 11 local site principal investigators, and I'm one at McMaster. There's 8 working groups who try and facilitate having the best data, what we want to actually measure in the CLSA. And there's over 160 researchers that are involved from over 26 institutions. And to actually get the data, to actually kind of when the rubber hits the road, there's over 120 operational staff. And I mean, all of the researchers are very, very important, but probably the ones that you would recognize are the staff. And here's just alphabetical order, no preferences. It's the McMaster data collection site staff. So these are some of the people who have come into your homes to interview you, who greet you when you come to the DCS and take your different measures. And along with the DCS staff, we actually have staff here from the National Coordinating Center that are helping us tonight, as well as from the BBC. So just again, here is a big schematic of the CLSA, just as a kind of a reminder. So in terms of at baseline, we have over 51,000 people that entered the study. They were 45 to 85 at baseline. And we have 2 different ways of collecting data. So we have the tracking, where we have over 21,000 people, and they're essentially randomly chosen from the 10 provinces, and they provide data through telephone interviews. And then we have the comprehensive cohort that have the in-home interviews face-to-face, so it's very similar in terms of the data collected, but a different way of doing it. And then they come to a data collection site. So just out of interest, we were inviting both tracking and comprehensive participants here. How many people are from the tracking group or for the telephone interviews? Oh, good, excellent, excellent, because we have presentations and some of the researchers are using all 50,000 data. So the nice thing about the CLSA is we have these 2 cohorts, but we can use the data from them combined together to have a study of over 50,000 if we want to do some analyses. And then the important part, of course, is that we have follow-up every 3 years. And what we try and do is we have events like this, and we have newsletters and things like that, because it's key to have the maintaining contact. Because really, in terms of getting everyone into the study, the important thing for us and the real benefit of the CLSA is to have that longitudinal data. So we really want to make sure that we keep people in the study as best as we can. And then finally, we will be doing data linkage as well with administrative data for those people who have agreed to do that. And I have this slide. I don't know if you can see it from the back. I show it to researchers. And essentially, I know you guys are probably, oh, I'm only too well aware of all of the modules that you ask us about in the questionnaires. But I think one of the really interesting things and one of the most important things about the CLSA is the fact that we have these 3 different constructs, these 3 different areas. And in many studies, in many research studies, you'll have a few risk factors collected, a few outcomes collected, and we look at the association between those. The CLSA really has extremely rich data that will allow for multidisciplinary studies and allow for us to look at research questions in aging that we haven't been able to do before. So we have a lot of demographic and lifestyle factors, health factors, but almost as much in terms of the social and the social construct as well in the CLSA. And as well, and for the people that are in the tracking, you're well aware of those, in the people that come to the data collection sites, we also have physical assessments that are undertaken. We have the height and weight, DEXA, and a number of different studies. And from what I understand, your absolute favorite is the cognitive assessment. I hear how much people like that. So who are we? And this is for our CLSA sample. It's about 50-50 males and females, and that was by design. We also, you can see the age breakdown here, and it goes from the bottom green is 45 to 54 to the top 75 to 85, and this was at baseline. But the idea was to have the most people between 45 or 45 and 64, because we're looking over 20 years in terms of the sample. And then here's another slide. It's a little bit busy, but here's the 10 provinces, and the neat thing here is you can see the blue dots represent the tracking cohort. So you can see, again, the tracking is essentially a random sample from the 10 provinces, and then the red dots represent the comprehensive participants. So you can see that there's the biggest population in the CLSA represents the provinces that have the largest populations. But even PEI, we have over 1,000 participants. And the reason is that we wanted to be able to say things about every province, so we collected our samples such that we had oversampling in places like PEI. In terms of where we are, we have completed for the tracking, we've completed over 15,300 interviews, and for the follow-up one. And the idea is that we'll be transitioning to follow-up 2 probably sometime in June. For the comprehensive, we've done over 29,500 in-home interviews and 25,700 DCS visits for follow-up 1. And the really exciting thing is that we're going to be starting up follow-up 2 very soon. And depending on the site, depending on how far along they are, it's going to be sometime between April and June as well. But actually here at McMaster, we're going to be starting some of the in-home interviews for follow-up 2 actually in the next couple of weeks. So it's a very exciting time. And the reason it's exciting is for the researchers is we're finally going to have longitudinal data. So it's a very, very good time. And as I said before, kind of research studies often have a small group of people that are answering very specific questions. They collect the data and ask those. But CLSA is really a research platform. So we collect the data, but we collect a really wide variety, a big breadth of data so that different questions can be asked by different researchers. So the CLSA is actually available to researchers across Canada and actually in the US and elsewhere. And currently, as I say, the baseline is available in terms of data, but the follow-up 1 is going to be available probably in early 2019. Essentially, once we complete the follow-up 1, the data which is being processed now will be fully processed at the Statistical Analysis Center, and then it's about 6 months and then it's available to researchers. So people can start creating their analysis plans. So here you can see these are representing the projects that we already have. And it's exciting that we've just kind of crossed our 100 research project. I guess we've had the final one, I think it was in the last submission date. But we're over 100 in terms of researchers using CLSA data. And one of the neat things about this slide, again, I'm not sure how well you can see it from the back, but the green is representing trainees, the blue is representing researchers. So you can see there's a lot of trainees or people that are doing their master's thesis or their PhD thesis using CLSA data. So we're very hopeful that if we get them young and interested in using the CLSA, as the better and better data become available, that we're going to have lots of researchers using the data. And that, to us, would be the biggest success, of course. And again, here's just an idea, just a smattering of the 100 projects, just kind of the diversity of what people are doing, looking at air pollution and chronic bronchitis, looking at the relationship between oral health and nutrition, lung function and sedentary time, social networking. People are looking at sarcopenia, we'll have a little bit of that today, and participation in the community, and resilience and healthy aging. And one of them is actually looking at a cross-country comparison. So looking at equity in successful aging, comparing Canadian results to those in France and Japan. So again, I only put this slide up because I want to point out this, I don't even know if I can use my pointer. I'm probably not that skilled, but this the big butterfly here in southern Ontario, that reflects McMaster researchers using, and Toronto too, but mostly McMaster, I think, using the CLSA data. So it's really being used across the country, but there's a lot of people that are really taking advantage of it here. And again, other uses of the data. We've been funded through the Public Health Agency of Canada and the Employment and, no, I'm going to get it wrong, Development, Employment and Social Development, thank you, Canada, to create a CLSA report. And this is really using high-level findings of the baseline data from CLSA. But again, it's trying to get it so that policymakers are going to be using the data. But it'll be available to researchers and you if you want it as well. These reports will be available. And as well, there's just recently a report of older Canadians on the move. And this is actually using CLSA data. So it's starting to be used for public policy development as well. And this is one that I like. This is my last slide, but this is a word cloud looking at what we ask people to do when they ask for CLSA data. One of the things they have to do is put in keywords. So the bigger the word, the more often that keyword has been used. And the neat thing here is you have age and health and cognition, frailty, all the things that you would think would be here, but the diversity of all the keywords that have been used is, I think, really quite impressive. So today, we're going to have a talk on sarcopenia, on spirometry, and on mobility and transportation. So I'm going to then pass the mic over to Dr. Stu Phillips. He's a professor in kinesiology and a Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Skeletal Muscle Health. He's also the director of the McMaster Center for Nutrition, Exercise, and Health and the Physical Activity Center of Excellence. And so without further ado, I will pass the baton to Stu.
Okay, so I'm going to use a roving microphone so I'm not tied to the podium here. I'd like everybody, if you're able, to stand up. And now sit back down. And stand up again. So you've just, no, you can sit down now, it's okay. You've just taken the first step in one of the things that I'm going to tell you about, and that's that if you're physically mobile, if you're able to stand and rise from a chair without any using the arm support, you're doing well. Because as soon as you can't do that, then you're destined at some point for full-time institutionalized care. I know, we start out with a depressing message, but it gets better. Whoops. So you can probably tell by my title that I think physical mobility is important. In fact, I think it's probably one of the biggest keys to successful aging. And I think it's really impressive, and this is a testament to modern medicine and to modern hygiene, that over the last 100 years, we've added 30+ years to our life expectancy. And that's astonishing when you look at human evolution in terms of how many people we've been able to keep alive and for how long. And it's this single fact that is the key to longer life and the root cause of the tidal wave of change that's impacting governments, individuals, healthcares, families, and communities. But I'm going to ask you an important question, and it's, what will your last 10 years look like? And I'm going to illustrate it with a video. If you've seen it before, don't spoil it for your neighbor. It's a pretty good one, and I think it gets the point across pretty well. Whoops.
What will your last 10 years look like? Will you be quick enough for a game of tag with your grandchild? Strong enough to embrace every moment? Will you grow old with vitality? Or get old with disease? It's time to decide. The average Canadian will spend their last 10 years in sickness. Change your future at makehealthlast.ca.
Now, the most impressive part about that video that's put out by the Heart and Stroke Foundation is that the gentleman on the left, who seems to be doing pretty well as he's aging, isn't taking a lot of medications, isn't spending a lot of time in hospital, but I like the fact that the biggest thing that they have him doing, did anybody notice what it was? A glass of wine, yeah. Touché, very good. He got on a bicycle. He got on a bicycle, and I think that's terrific. It's a great message. So what do we have to worry about? What are the leading causes of mortality? We're a little bit frozen here, sorry guys. Thank you. So this is what we have to worry about if we're men. The #1 killer in Canada now is cancer. It's overtaken cardiovascular and cerebrovascular disease, probably because we're so good at treating those things. It's a little bit different if we're women, but not much. The #1 killer is still cancer. But it's not about mortality, because the rate of that's holding constant at 100%. So if you came here expecting to cheat that, I'm sorry. But it's about quality of life. And I'd put it to you that one of the keys to quality of life is the ability to be physically mobile. The interesting part is that these are the diseases that are associated with reductions in health-related quality of life. Cancer, heart disease, stroke, lung disease, diabetes, renal disease, depression, mental health, osteoporosis, osteoarthritis, and the list goes on. So with each chronic, non-communicable disease we have, our quality of life goes down. On top of all these diseases, however, is another disease, and we've now been given an international classification of disease code for this, but it makes all of them worse. And the problem is that the disease is so under-recognized that rarely is anything ever done to treat it. But it makes all of those ones that I told you about before worse. And in fact, most clinicians, most doctors, and a lot of healthcare professionals would consider this disease a normal and inevitable part of aging. The disease is called sarcopenia, and if you never heard of it, I don't blame you. You might have heard of osteopenia, which is the precursor to osteoporosis, but it describes the slow and insipid age-related loss of muscle and strength. The quantity of muscle has a sub-target, and it's called myopenia. That's what your leg looks like at around 20 years old in a cross-section. That's what it looks like at around 70. And I know a lot of people say, well, look at the marbling in there. That's good, right? And it's not if you're a person. And strength or function is Dynap Nia. And the test that I had all of you do right at the start, the ability to rise from a chair, is one of those classic tests that we use in my lab to establish how physically able someone is and how able they are to withstand the rigors of getting older. So collectively, we're told that this is an age-related process, and there's not really much we can do about it. And the answer is probably some of that is true. But you can mitigate it. You can slow the decline just a little bit. And I'd put it to you that that's more important, I think, because it has an impact on your risk for all of those other diseases as well. I'll show you what I mean. So what does it mean to be sarcopenic, to have low muscle mass, to have poor muscle function at age 65? It means that by age 80, you're 4 times more likely to be frail. And frailty usually describes somebody who's in full-time institutionalized care. You're 3.5 times more likely to have what we call a major mobility disability. In other words, you can't do something that you would normally do to get around the house every day. You're 12 times more likely to be functionally dependent in 1 or more tasks. You'd have to ask somebody to take the jar or the lid off of a jar. You'd have to ask for help to get upstairs. You would definitely take the elevator. You're 3.8 times more likely to be institutionalized, and you're 4.3 times more likely to be socially isolated. You live alone. But what if there were a treatment that would lower the risk for all known chronic diseases? It works regardless of your age, your sex, your race, or pre-existing risk. It already has a large evidence base on which to base recommendations and saves the healthcare system billions of dollars. And the side effect profile is actually pretty good. Unlike drugs where we list all of the side effects that might be negative, the positive side effect profile of this treatment is undeniable. A reduced incidence of depression, a potential for reduced incidence of dementia, diabetes, and even suicide incidents. What are we talking about? Well, there's 2 things: diet and activity. There are patterns of diets, things like the Mediterranean diet that are high in olive oil, eating energy-dense, not eating energy-dense, nutrient-poor foods, eating energy-rich foods. Patterns of activity like walking 10 minutes per day can reduce your risk for dementia by almost 30%. But a shockingly small number of Canadians do this. And most of us now spend a lot of time doing what you're doing right now. I know I had you stand up at the start, and you're all going to go out for a walk later and tomorrow and everything else, right? So good for you. But the point is that I don't think that there is a lifestyle intervention that will top these for reducing your risk for all of the diseases I've talked about. Improving your mobility and enhancing and diversifying your diet are the 2 most powerful things that we have control over. Not always easy to do. That's my rider statement. But the upside is huge. I like to use an analogy to tell people that aging well is like sitting on a stool. If one of those legs, who's ever sat on a stool, and the frustrating thing is it wobbles around, right? One of those legs is a little bit shaky, and you know that something's going to give at some point. And I tell people that the 3 most important legs are as follows. I think it's the most important, and that's clearly to be physically active. Okay? You might hear something else from a few other people this evening. That's okay. These are the very broad strokes. First of all, find an activity you like doing. If I told everybody to go out and do what we call high-intensity interval training and run up the stairs, we have a ton of them in Hamilton, they're great. Tomorrow, one or two of you might do it. The next day, I'm betting that nobody would do it. So find something you like. Minutes count. Increase your activity level 10 minutes at a time. Everything helps. And I think people don't believe that. People don't believe things like parking a little bit further from the entrance to the grocery store. It's true. Everything counts. Active time can be social time. Look for a group or activities or classes in your community. Walk wherever and whenever you can. There's a trail system in this city that is actually, I think, in terms of trail systems in urban areas, unparalleled. A massive number of great walking trails. Carry your groceries home. Get a membership at a gym, lift weights. Eat well most of the time. The great part about exercise is it forgives a lot of sins. And so if you like to eat, you better exercise. Here's a few really broad strokes. Real foods. Whole foods like milk, eggs, cheese, lean meat, variety, vegetables and fruits, whole grains, nuts, anything that, you know the analogy, more than 4 ingredients on the label, look at it sort of sideways. And if you do like to eat things with more than 4 ingredients on the label, that's fine, but you had better be physically active. And the last one is to engage socially. And this one is something I'm learning a lot about, particularly with my association with the CLSA, about how important it is for older people to feel that they are plugged in and connected somehow to their friends, families, and their communities. There are studies now showing that if you are engaged, even on a small level, with something that makes you feel part of something, that your health status improves. It's astonishing how important it is. A rich web of human relationship enhances your health and stimulates your mind and memory. How many friends and relatives do you hear from monthly? How many friends and relatives do you feel at ease talking to about private matters? How many friends and relatives do you feel you could call on for help? The answers to those 3 questions are astonishingly predictive of a person's health status. When you get all 3 things together, the stool's pretty well balanced. And sometimes I know that we might fall a little bit short on some of these here, but this is the key to successful aging. So, where does the CLSA fit in? I'd like to be able to show you some actual data, some numbers that support this. That's coming soon. Come back a year from now, or maybe 2. We'll show you something. Who ages well and why? Who ages free from disease? Who spends their last 10 years not in sickness, but in health? Are there early warning signs that we can see who is not aging well? At age 53, for example, not that that bears any personal relevance, but around there, wouldn't it be great to know if you weren't going to age well and that there was something you could do? We might be able to get that. How much physical activity do you need? What kind of physical activity do you need? What type of behaviors do you need to engage in that physical activity? What kind of diet do you need to eat? How predictive of your future self is what you're eating now? What types of social engagement and how often? Does this vary if you live in a rural versus an urban area? And what influence do racial, cultural, sexual, gender, and a multitude of other influences have on all of these questions? These are all fantastic questions that for the first time in Canadian history, we will have longitudinal data. And if the impact of that is maybe a little bit lost on you, let me just say this. If we took a cross-sectional look at Hamilton 10 years ago and we said, what's happening now? Is it predictive of the future? The answer is, all we could do is say, well, this is associated with this, but with a longitudinal collection of data, we can say, look at how somebody changed. And that, in the world of science, is like a piece of gold. So I want to thank each of you, whether you're in the tracking cohort or the comprehensive cohort, or if you're just out and enjoying the talks this evening, and thank you for what you're doing, because it's an absolutely superb, rich resource. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Stu. I kind of feel that we should all just get up and go and walk around now, but I'm going to ask you, there's a couple more speakers, and we'll stay in our seats, but then I promise if you go up to the second floor, you can actually walk around and see all the art. So it was very, very motivating. So our next speaker is Dr. Mylinh Duong. She's a respirologist in the Department of Medicine here at McMaster. And her major clinical interest is in the population lung health, and specifically in the epidemiology of COPD. So she's going to be presenting on the importance of lung function in predicting mortality and disability. So I will pass it on to Mylinh.
Thank you. Oops, sorry, I just went the other way. Okay, so my talk today is specifically on spirometry, which is what's been done in the CLSA study to assess lung function. And my task today is really to give you a brief introduction to what spirometry is and what we're trying to capture in this study. So what is spirometry? For those of you that's in a comprehensive cohort, you would have all gone through this at the baseline collection of data, and we're going through the follow-up right now. And as you all know, it's not a simple test to go through. Well, it takes quite a bit of effort. It is safe and is becoming easier to actually do at a population level. And what we're trying to capture here is the maximal amount of air that the lung can take in one breath, and the speed at which that volume is actually being moved in and out of the lungs. So essentially, we're trying to estimate your maximum lung capacity. So how does spirometry come about? It's been around for more than 150 years at least. And it was first actually introduced back in the 1800s by a physician that actually worked for the insurance company. And what he wanted to do was to find a clinical measure that is able to predict early mortality. And he achieved that. What he found was through using this particular device, and it was actually quite cumbersome right up until about 20 years ago, you can actually measure the maximum volume of air that a person can expire, and through this volume, you can predict someone's mortality or premature mortality. And he coined this volume or this measure the vital capacity. And to this day, we continue to use that term to capture the maximum volume that a person can breathe out. And that's essentially what we're trying to measure on spirometry. So as you can see, over time, over the last 100 years, spirometry has undergone quite a bit of change in terms of the device that we use. And the one that's right in the far left to you is what we use these days in the lab, so in the hospital setting. And it's not practical at all, other than in the hospital setting. But in the last 30 years or so, things have changed quite considerably in terms of the technology to the point now where you can actually have very small devices, as you can see, that patient can actually buy and use at home to measure their lung function on a daily basis. And because of this technology, we're now able to measure people's lung function at a population level. And why is that important? Well, as you can see, the vital capacity, as we know, when it was first introduced, still predicts mortality quite well, despite being compared to all the other clinical measures that we have, including blood pressure, various blood levels, and biomarkers. Now, the FEV1 is the other measure that we measure, and that's looking at how fast you can breathe out. And together, these two measurements provide us an estimation of what your maximum lung capacity is at peak exercise. So in some ways, when we measure your spirometry or your lung function on spirometry, we have a fair idea of your level of peak exercise performance and your level of fitness. So up until in the last 10 to 15 years, spirometry has been purely done in a hospital setting, usually in people who have symptoms or have signs of disease or lung disease, or who have risk factors. So the indication is really to detect or pick up lung damage or loss of lung function, to diagnose particularly COPD and asthma, and to assess disability or people's level of symptoms. And finally, it is a predictor in people with lung disease, a very strong predictor of their survival. Now, at the population level, now that we're able to measure this at a healthy population, the community level, we're starting to understand better where does lung function stand or what role it plays in health or in general health. And as you can see, this is some of the data that's been published out there that looks at lung function and your odds of having heart disease or dying from heart disease, as well as lung disease, and definitely all-cause mortality, which has been known to be closely associated with your lung function level. And so, as you can see, as your lung function level increases up to 100%, your odds of dying from heart disease actually goes down quite sharply. And similarly, for all-cause mortality or death due to any causes at all, it actually goes down quite sharply as well. And these bars represent smokers, ex-smokers and non-smokers. So this trend or this association with death and with heart disease as well as lung disease is actually seen in both smokers and non-smokers. So it's a very strong relationship that actually exists between lung function and outcome. So what more can we actually get from looking at lung function out in the population? Over the last 15 years, as I mentioned, more population studies are coming through looking at lung function in health. And now we have managed to piece together lung function that's been measured at various time points in people's lives, and we have pieced together now what we think happens to lung function over the life course of an individual. And this is all done cross-sectionally. And as you can see, at the time of birth, right up into your early 20s, there is quite a rapid lung growth, and your lung function continues to increase until it reaches its maximum level around the early 20s, where it actually stays at that level for the next decade or so. Around about the early or mid-30s, that's when the decline starts to happen, and that's related to aging. So this is what happens in a healthy individual with no symptoms and no lung disease. This is another path that another individual can take. If they had exposures to certain environment or some insult to their health, early on in life in the first 10 years, where these insults or environmental exposures actually has an impact on their lung growth, and so they never reach their maximal potential. And as you can see, this person here reaches a lower peak level, but their rate of aging or their decline is the same as normal, but they will reach that level of symptoms much quicker. Whereas with this individual here, they reach their potential of the peak lung function, but they've got a much faster age-relating decline. And therefore, they will also, compared to a healthy or normal person, they will reach that level of symptoms or disability much quicker. And then finally, you've got this path where you've got an early exposure or insult to your health that affects your lungs. You've never reached your potential, and then you've got a faster decline. We're now faced with questions where we're asking what are the early factors that actually impact your development and prevent you from reaching that level. And more importantly, in terms of the CLSA, what are the factors that actually increases your decline with aging? And this will then be able to help us to understand better what are some of the factors that we should be concentrating on to improve lung growth so that everybody reaches their maximal potential. And what are the factors that are able to maintain your lung much longer and to slow your decline with aging? And this is not just important in terms of in health, but also in people who actually have lung disease. Is there anything that we're able to intervene early on before the aging process starts, or even during the aging process, where we can shift them from that course up to that course and prevent them from reaching that level of disability sooner and therefore improve their quality of life? And so a lot of the work in the CLSA data is really looking towards finding all these other lifestyle, environmental behaviors that would allow us to shift people from this curve up to this curve so that we can prevent disability and prevent early mortality. So the message that I wanted to get across is that spirometry, although it does take quite a bit of effort when people are trying to perform it, it is important and simple way of measuring people's lung capacity. There's a lot to be learned in terms of what lung capacity and its role in health and how we can attain better lung capacity or lung health throughout a person's life course. And more importantly, what are the factors that can actually maintain lung health as you go through your life, and particularly with aging, so that we can reduce the level of disability and improve mortality. I thank you for your attention, and I hope you will continue to to blow.
I have to say, when I was going through the slides, this was one of my favorites, was this one. So I'll keep it on for a little bit. But the next speaker is Dr. Brenda Vrkljan. She's an occupational therapist here at McMaster, and her area of research is aging, medical fitness to drive, and transportation mobility. And her talk is going to be Aging and Driving in Canada. So she'll be presenting some of the CLSA data that we have from the transportation module. Brenda?
Thank you. So certainly a pleasure to be here tonight. How many people drove here tonight? Woo! Yep, you are CLSA participants, all right. When you'll see that in a moment. And certainly I wouldn't be up here without the work of wonderful colleagues behind the scenes, but I have the pleasure of speaking with you tonight. So the research that I'm going to talk about and the work that I do is focused on driving and transportation mobility, and certainly my role here at the McMaster Institute for Research on Aging as well, which has just been established, is exciting to work with cross-disciplinary colleagues. So just to begin, I want to tell you about a phone call I had last June to head out to visit Russ. Russ had read a blog that I had wrote on the Labarge Optimal Aging Portal, or the McMaster Optimal Aging Portal. And so there's myself and my PhD student speaking with Russ. And of course, Russ is driving every day to meet friends, to go to the doctor's appointments, or to go to his doctor's appointments, and to go to his woodworking class. And yep, Russ is 99 years old. Yes, so Russ is a former World War II pilot, certainly recognizes the value of retraining and the importance of retraining, and he spoke a lot about that. He's written a book called Deaths Averted, and where he talks about going to skid school in older adulthood as an older driver to learn some more skills on how to handle his car on ice. But certainly when Rahina and I, my PhD student, met Russ, I mean, we had some concerns in terms of his ability to move in his environment. But it's important to note, and you wonder, how exactly is Russ performing behind the wheel? Because we want to keep him well. I'm an occupational therapist, as Lauren introduced me, Dr. Griffith. And when I talk about the term occupation, we want to make sure that we help people do the things that occupy their time. And when we talk about the things that occupy people's time across a lifespan, it's certainly your ability to do the things that are important to you. And when you're able to do those things, you feel better about your health and well-being. Our profession's been around. We're just about to celebrate our 100th year as a profession. We emerged after World War I to help veterans return to society, and certainly that's our role today as well, is to help people be the best they can be and participate in society, particularly after they've experienced a health-related change. And so when it comes to driving, an important tenet of our profession certainly is to help people be able to get to the places that are important to them, to be able to do the things that are important to them. And clinical decisions, I worked in beautiful Chatham, Ontario as a therapist, and people would often say, when I would ask them, what is it you want to get back to doing? And not surprisingly, driving would come up over and over again. People wanted to return home, of course, but driving was very important to them. So how, as a healthcare professional, do we make decisions about driving? We want to make sure we get that decision right, because it has huge implications on people's ability to get to places that are important and to live their lives. When we don't make the right decision, it can have implications on public safety, on that individual's safety, other people on the road. And of course, if we don't get the decision right, that may mean somebody has to move. That may mean that there's burden on caregivers to help with transportation. So we really want to make sure that we get that decision right. And certainly I saw that on the front line as an occupational therapist in Chatham, Ontario. So there's a research network that was established in Canada called the CANDrive Research Network, which stands for the Canadian Driving Research Initiative for Vehicular Safety in the Elderly. And the design of the study was so appreciated that they adopted it in Australia, so it's called Ozcan Drive, where they're following the exact same protocol that we've done here in Canada. So our aim is to try to develop that scientifically valid method of determining medical fitness to drive, or as we refer to it, a risk stratification tool. So some of these tests that we did with our participants might be familiar to you as well. For those who participate in the CLSA study, we asked people to do all kinds of things, stand on one leg, timed up and go, as well as some tests of thinking skills. The second part of the study, which is quite unique, is actually tracking how people drove. So there was a GPS device that was put in people's car. That's one of our research assistants, just about to install a device. And what we're able to do is track every trip our participants made in their vehicle. And so the Google map that you see there is one trip by one of our participants from our CANDrive site that was located up in Ancaster. And what's important there is we could track braking patterns, we can track acceleration patterns, and we can even track where people go. which is Tim Hortons. So, not surprisingly, but I mean, that's an example, and that's a true story. But what's at Tim Hortons, right? It's what Dr. Phillips talked about before, social participation, being able to be with others, and as I said, participate in occupations of meaning. So we're really, it's very important that people are able to get to the places that are important to them. And the third and final part of our study with CANDrive was to actually track crashes and violations across our sites here in Canada as well as in Australia. And you might already notice that we actually had the highest number of crashes in the first year of the study here in Hamilton, yes. That's not something we're proud of course, but you can see we dropped off in the second year of the study and as we moved along. Fortunately, nobody was injured or killed in our CANDrive study, which could have happened across the 7 years that we collected data. But people did crash, and it was their fault. And what we're able to do is then pull that data together with their driving patterns and all those measures that people filled out to develop that risk stratification tool. So yes, there were crashes in our study, and our participants were generous enough to provide access to their driving records, which was a partnership with the Ministry of Transportation as well, here in Ontario and in other provinces across Canada. Yep, so I just wanted to point out that we dropped, so that's good. So we have over 38 million kilometers of data from our participants in Canada, and this is a heat map from Hamilton of our participants. So you can see that people are driving on all kinds of highways, or on all kinds of roadways, on highways, we can look at time of day, what the weather was like. So it's quite exciting to be able to analyze that data as well. You have important places to go, and we want to help you get there safely. So we want to make sure that, that we enable that, of course, and that's the goal of the CANDrive study. So not surprisingly, when we look at some of our results across the 5 years, we had lots of differences in our study, in our over 1,000 participants that were involved in the CANDrive study. People noted changes in their driving comfort and perceived driving abilities in certain areas. So for example, people started to feel less comfortable driving on highways or at night. The ability to stand on one leg, their thinking skills, and of course, as we might expect, medications and medical conditions increased. Because we had tracked the driving patterns as well, we can see that kilometers driven per day decreased, trip distance, average speed, number of trips, and trip frequency. And that's important to consider too as we age, to understand our travel patterns and the way we negotiate our daily life. So with the CANDrive Catalyst grant that we were funded for here in Hamilton, I guess, well, I guess nationally, I should say, we're able to look at 50,000 Canadians and try to kind of build up some of our findings from the CANDrive study, which is a much smaller study when you see the 928 Canadians. So our CANDrive study was volunteer, which is important to note, whereas you look at the CLSA, we have a random sample, as Lauren introduced before, which is really important to see because with people who volunteer for a study, you might expect them to behave a little bit differently when it comes to driving. So with the CLSA data, we get to look at a random sample. There are so many health and functional measures. We don't have GPS driving patterns, but we do have people and thank you to those of you, to everyone that's answered those questions, but we do ask you questions about your driving and how you feel in certain driving situations, and to be able to analyze how that changes. You can see in the middle that I talk about social participation and social frailty, which is actually a discussion on TVO's The Agenda this week, talking about healthy aging and how we enable that. So we really want to see the relationship in the CLSA study with social participation and how people use transportation, because we, again, want to enable people. We know that's critical to people's health and well-being, is to be able to be with others. So here's, ta-da, some CLSA data, and not surprising that we see that, boy, driving, just as we saw the number of hands go up here in the room, that most people are relying on their automobile across a lifespan. But we can see as we age that in terms of a gender difference. So at 75 years and older, we do see a lower proportion of women reporting that they have a driver's license. And we also see a difference in urban and rural areas, which is important because most of Canada, just as I said, I worked in beautiful Chatham, Ontario, which was really the metropolis in southwestern Ontario for places like Tilbury and Ridgetown. So we do need to think about how people negotiate their daily lives with or without a car in rural Canada. And when we look at prevalence of driving versus other forms of transit across the lifespan, again, you see that most people are driving their own vehicle. But you can see that women, again, over the age of 75, are relying on other, they still drive, but they rely on other forms of transportation more. And when we look at the use of transportation alternatives like darts that we see, and although we see lots of darts vans darting around Hamilton, very few people are actually using that form of transportation. Very few Canadians actually report using that, and most of them, which is still a very, very small percentage, are women. When we look at transportation and sex differences, along with people that report lower and have a harder time doing their activities of daily living, which is really important as an occupational therapist. That's what we want to. Our job is really to help enable you to do those things. But when people aren't able to do those things easily, they are still reporting, this is men, you can see that driving is still the most common. Unfortunately, you can't see the bottom there, but the biggest bar is driving, and you can see how it stays relatively the same for men. As well, the second highest bar there is being a passenger in a car, and so that also, you can see differences in each of the age groups. With women, slightly different. You can see that in the youngest age groups, driving, and still across all the age groups, you see that driving is the biggest proportion. But, and then you see a larger group reporting being a passenger. Again, we see alternative forms of transportation. Bicycling was in there, Stu, just so you know, and very few people are bicycling, according to the CLSA data, right now, that's right, we're gonna be able to track that. We're gonna be able to track that. It's gonna be very exciting. So I want to tell you, hopefully it hasn't started yet, just give me a moment, but the most exciting part, and I think Lauren alluded to that, is being able to train the next generation of Canadian researchers and innovators. And so a group of my graduate students participated in making a video for one of our research networks. So this is their 3-minute video about our project.
My love for cars started at a very early age, and my first car was a 1960 Ford Falcon. That car represented independence, and it represented freedom to me, and it meant everything. Now that I'm older, the car is just as important to me. I rely on it for everything, for getting groceries, going to doctor's appointments, running my grandchildren around. I need a car, and I hope I can drive as long as I can.
Drivers aged 65 and older are the fastest growing cohort of drivers in Canada. In 2009, there were 3.25 million older drivers. By 2028, this number is expected to double. Unfortunately, as we get older, there are medical conditions that can affect our ability to drive safely. The social and economic impact of collisions is staggering. The social costs of crashes to the Canadian economy are estimated to be $62 billion per year. Preventing such collisions from happening in the first place is key. Our Auto 21 research team brings together researchers and graduate students from 5 different universities and programs. In collaboration with our industrial partners, GoPro and Percentec, this is the first study in the world that quantifies driving performance with crashes across time. Our project combines functional and medical information, as well as actual behavior behind the wheel using GPS and HD camera technology to have the most comprehensive picture of older drivers.
And I'm sure you've heard all the stereotypes about older drivers. First of all, we drive too slow. We leave our turn signals on. We park at weird angles.
Results from our project have already proven existing stereotypes about older drivers wrong. Our participants are driving at or above the speed limit and keeping up with the flow of traffic. From the driving errors analyzed, we found that over 80% of them were actually due to bad habits. Understanding older drivers is our opportunity to do better. First, we can use the information from our research to develop customized feedback and retraining protocol personalized to the older driver in question. Second, the automotive industry can use data from our camera system to inform better designs that avoid collisions. Our results will provide the evidence that will promote the safety of older drivers and other road users in Canada and beyond.
It's amazing how far the automotive industry has come since I was young. And thanks to Canadian research and innovation, I hope to keep driving as long as I can.
So, if you want to learn more about aging and driving now, I have written that blog that Russ found in terms of what does drawing clocks have to do with driving cars, because we know here in Ontario that at age 80 you will be asked to do that test, and there's rationale for why you're asked to do that. I also had the opportunity to speak on the agenda on TVO, and so I talk a little bit more detail about our CAN Drive study. So if you do a Google search, you can find out a little bit more about the CAN Drive study. And of course, autonomous cars are coming, right, here in Canada. And I was invited to speak to the Senate, which had commissioned a special series of investigations around the impact of autonomous vehicles and how we prepare Canada for the road ahead. And so if you Google Senate of Canada report and driving change, you will read a little bit more about how Canada's preparing for that. So thank you very much, and thanks to all of you for participating in the CLSA project. I look forward to looking and examining your data. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Brenda. And now, I mean, I think it's really interesting. We have very different areas, but all with a real relevance in terms of the CLSA data and how applicable it is. So our last speaker is Dr. Cynthia Balion. She's an associate professor in the Department of Pathology and Molecular Medicine. She's also the director of the Biorepository and Bioanalysis Center. And one of the things she's doing, again, that's quite interesting, is creating, using CLSA data, reference intervals for blood biomarkers for older adults, because essentially all of these reference intervals are done in healthy younger adults, and they're applied very, very broadly. So her work is very important in terms of understanding the importance of having these different population reference intervals. So I will pass it over to our last speaker, Cynthia. There you go.
Hello. I'm the last speaker, but hopefully one that's going to bring some interest to the world that I live in, which is laboratory medicine. And the reason why I'm here for the CLSA is because of my expertise in biospecimens and biomarkers. So we'll get started on that topic. This is who I am, and this is what I do here. So some of you may have taken a visit already to our biorepository. There's visualized on the left here. On the right is the laboratory upstairs. It's just a machine up there, other machines. It's a regular lab that does biomarker testing, and we're really ramping that up quite quickly. Now, those are biospecimens. So biological specimens, it's our short word, biospecimens. So typically you hear of urine and blood collected. You might not hear about tissue so much. Usually tissue is taken during a, I don't know why that's there. Uh-oh. Well, I know what was there, so I can tell you what was there. But the material typically collected is blood and urine tissue specimens taken if you have a surgery and they take out a peat of cancer, and then this healthy tissue next to it, and that's saved. And so those tissue samples are incredibly important to figure out, cancer and treatment of cancer. We had considered briefly, and I think Stu mentioned sarcopenia, about taking a tissue sample from CLSA participants, a little skin biopsy, but we decided we wouldn't do that for you guys. And the other fluid types that you don't see, all gobbledygook, well, we don't take those either. But it's just to say that there's a ton of fluid samples that we analyze in the clinical laboratory. What's the biomarker? Well, the biomarker, this is a fancy, very technical definition of what a biomarker is, a characteristic that is objectively measured. You can read it if you want. Basically, it's anything you can measure in the body, whichever way. It's something that measures, something that you can detect that shows something biologically happening in the body. So typically, you think about it as, a biomarker in a fluid specimen, but it can be physiological, blood pressure, heart rate, imaging studies. So when you go for any type of diagnostic imaging, that's a biomarker because it shows what's happening in the body. I'm more into the bottom part, which most people are, the molecular part. So I look at little things that you can't see. So the cholesterol, the glucose, the proteins, and the genes, not so much. It's not my area. There's other people within the CLSA who know tons about that and are doing work with genetic material. What they can be used for? Research, okay. What is research? Well, understand how our body operates. So just simple biomarkers, complicated biomarkers. A whole wealth of biomarkers can be used to figure out how the body functions. Clinically, we use it to identify disease. So examples being hemoglobin A1C and glucose for diabetes. And then for heart failure, we have a heart failure marker called NT-proBNP. We can use it for looking at treatment. Is you're getting a drug, is it working? So we'll look at a biomarker to see if it's working, but we're also looking to see if it's doing harm, so side effects, the good and the bad. And we can also look at it to see, how well the disease is developing or not. So what is the likelihood of the disease progressing further? So it comes to the point of how did we decide on what to test? Like there's hundreds and thousands of biomarkers to test for. And luckily we live in Canada, we don't have to pay for them. But if we lived in other countries, we'd have to pay for these tests, and they can be quite expensive. So this is a Canadian study, this is a government study, so we have to be really, really, really careful about how we chose what biomarkers. I'd say, get the best, the bang for the buck, so to speak. So the type of biomarker we decided to choose, types of biomarkers, they had to be related to disorders of people who are aging. So chronic disorders particularly, anything relating to aging mechanisms, and anything that other people in aging studies have looked at, so we can sort of blend our data together and make more information available. So that was sort of one of the principles. The second principle was to look at the amount of sample, so the aliquot, the amount of sample that we needed to test to get these biomarkers. Because these samples that all of you have donated, have given to us, they're irreplaceable. We can't go back and get your sample that you gave to us 3 years ago. You might remember what you did 3 years ago and fill out some questionnaires, but we can't get that biosample. So it's incredibly important that we use it to the ultimate. So I'm very particular about when I have a sample that the most gets used out of it. So we're quite good, and I'll give you a list of what biomarkers we ended up using in a moment. The third part, which was really important, is how we did the analysis to ensure that the analysis was of the highest quality possible. That way, all the results that we have from these samples, these tests, can be used directly for improvement to the health of Canadians. This is, I don't know if any of you have been in a laboratory before. I particularly like this instrument. It's pretty, it's blue, I don't know. But this is one of the typical analyzers that you'll see in a clinical laboratory. In fact, it's the analyzer that we utilize for measurement of the serum biomarkers. We send our biomarkers to Calgary Lab Services, And we do that because we formed a partnership with them. And like I mentioned before, analysis is pretty expensive. So they gave us a good deal, and they were able to do a really good analysis for us. And this is an instrument that they use. What do we know? Well, unfortunately, there aren't that many studies. It's hard to find them. They're not great. There's inconsistency, because they're small populations. As people get older, there's less and less people to choose from. There's also a limitation in the analytical method, so how they tested the biomarkers, they may not have used the best method possible, so lots of variation. And there's also factors like age and disease and medication. As we age, you know, you're more likely to have a disease than not to have a disease. So as was mentioned earlier, what is normal for older people compared to younger people? When we did this review, we did find something interesting in that most of the time, if you take generally speaking, the biomarker concentration in older people, they're different than younger people. So that's important, because currently, very, very few tests that are done in the clinical laboratory utilize age-specific reference intervals. You're all compared to the younger cohort, like 20 to 45 in general. These are the biomarkers we chose. For hematology, hematology is done right at the data collection set. The basic cell types are measured, and then calculated measurements are done as well on the analyzers. So your basic hematology biomarkers. Your core biomarkers that are done. And to mention that these, when I say the word core biomarkers, these are tests that are done each time, repeatedly. We may do different biomarkers at different times, but these are going to be done every time you donate a blood sample. These tests will be done, so we can see longitudinally how it changes over time. So this is a group of tests that we do, and they essentially look at different body systems or organs. Albumin, alanine, ALT look at liver function. We have CRP that looks at inflammation. We have creatinine that looks at kidney function, ferritin that looks at anemia. We have free T4 and thyroid stimulating hormone, which looks at your thyroid. We have hemoglobin, A1C, of course, diabetes, and then lipids looking at cardiovascular health, and vitamin D at bone health. So we took a large, like with very few markers, we were able to cover a large range of different disorders. New for follow-up 1, so we're ready to send out samples to the lab again, and we're gonna add 2 more biomarkers. NT-proBNP and troponin T, heart biomarkers. That's one area we didn't cover. But unfortunately at the expense, because everything costs money, we're not doing vitamin D anymore. Vitamin D research over the time period when we first started has shown that not so important anymore. So that's one thing about the CLSA, it will change. It will change based on the scientific research that comes from other people. And this is how we're changing. So what do we know? So this is a good part. This is what we know so far about hemoglobin in Canada. It's called the Canadian Health Measures Survey. It started in 2007. Essentially, it's about 5,000 to 6,000 people every 2 years. It covers the whole age range from 3 to 79. So if you look at this graph, you can see age on the x-axis, Y is the concentration. The blue dots are male, the magenta dots are female. Yes, it's true, females have lower concentration of hemoglobins than male, but essentially, you know, as soon as you become an adult, it appears to level out. So I blocked out the part of data that the CLSA doesn't have, and this is the data that CLSA does have. Now I'm going to show you the CLSA data. The CLSA data has about 60 times more participants in it. 60 times. This is what happens. You get a change. There's a change that happens. You didn't see this change in the other data because there weren't enough data points to see this. But what happens in males and in females is there's a decrease. The decrease is a lot sharper for males and less so for females. They never equal each other, even at the very end, but there is a decline. And this wasn't noticed in the data that we had previously from Canadians. And now we have this data, and now we're going to see, how this can be used. We don't have any outcome studies to know how important it is, but it is important to show that adults are not adults at all. They're not the same at all ages. They do change. So similarly, this is for white blood cells. You see, again, the males and females and the magenta and blue dots, they seem to overlap each other. They don't really change over time. Again, this is the data that we have for this CMHS has, just a small set. And this is what we have from CLSA. There's a change. There's an increase. Before hemoglobin was a decrease, white blood cells, female initially decrease, the menopause years, and then increase. So these are new findings. They haven't been published yet. We're still assessing what we're going to do with them. But I wanted to show you that, to say that your data really, really has shown something that has never been shown before in Canada. And I think this will really help in clinical work in the future. So coming up, we've got more work to be done with the hematology data, with the chemistry data. We've got the release of the data from the genome-wide genotyping. So people are going to understand more about the genetics of the participants. Epigenetic data is coming. And then we're also going to be releasing the aliquots, the frozen tubes of blood and urine that we have stored to participants on a very restricted basis, make sure the study question is great. So I just really want to thank all of you for participating in this study and waiting to the very end to hear my presentation. And I hope you all get the chance to see the Biorepository, because it's kind of cool. Thank you.
Yes. So I'm going to invite the speakers back up for our question and answer. And I'm going to give. So we want to make sure we end on time because we have our tours happening, but I will take a few questions, and there's a number of us that can be around, I think, for a little while.
Hi. My question relates to the following statement, that one of the things that we've been told is choose your parents well. I chose parents, like many and many other people in the room, who were heavy smokers from the time they got their first jobs in the war factories in the 1930s. And I noticed when I was interviewed in the cohort that there were a tremendous amount of questions, more than I thought, about secondhand smoke. So I'd like to know what I can, and others who were exposed to so much secondhand smoke through our childhood, can do about it.
Exercise.
I can only speak from a lung perspective. We do have good data in children cohort studies that show that secondhand exposure or indirect exposure, even during pregnancy, so moms who actually smoke, the child's lung function is affected and they fail to reach their potential. So they actually have lower lung function compared to children whose mothers did not smoke during pregnancy. To go even further than that, there's actually now studies showing that grandparents who smoke, and if smoking skips a generation, so the mother did not smoke, the children actually grow up with asthma and lower lung function. So there's actually a generation effect that gets passed on as well, and we think that this is done through epigenetics, not so much genetic, but the epigenetic phenomena. The thing we don't know is that whether these children, do they go on and continue to have low lung function, because a lot of these low birth cohort studies or children's studies have not followed them long enough. And that is something that is actively being looked into. Secondhand smoke exposure or indoor exposure as adults, the effects are still controversy in terms of the studies, so we don't know the impact of that. But we think it's bad because most of these participants do have a lot of symptoms, but the studies in terms of showing its impact on lung function are still very mixed.
Exercise forgives a lot of sins. It doesn't matter what condition you have, but your risk is reduced if you're a smoker, if you're overweight, if you've got, you name the disease, it forgives a lot of things. So, mine's the good message.
Hi, I have a process question for this study because I can't remember what I agreed to. If, for instance, when you're doing testing, if the bone density score is quite low, do you break the study confidentiality to contact my doctor or call me to get treatment for it? I'm sorry, I can't remember that.
In terms of the tests that are done that have clinical interpretation, that there are appropriate reference intervals, we do give you the information when it is available. In terms of many of the other tests that we do, even the biospecimens that we take, they may not be tested for years or, decades later, potentially. And so those are things that, in, say, the retinal images where we don't have any direct data from them. So when there is clinical applicability, then we do give that information back. I think there was another question over here.
I was just going to talk about exercise.
Great.
And I have this extremely bossy dog, Harry, who's a Cavalier King Charles Spaniel, and he insists on taking me out every single day. Here's to Harry.
I love him. I love him. And again, it goes back to, I think a really important point to make to everybody is the #1 cited reason for people not exercising is lack of time. That's self-report. So whether that's it or not, we don't really know. But let's just say it is lack of time. One of the things that we know from observational, not longitudinal, but observational studies, is that when you take somebody that does nothing to doing something, that's the biggest reduction in risk. So really whatever gets you out the door or off the couch, so to speak, it doesn't matter. And everybody says exercise in the gym and everything. And look, I like to spend time in the gym, but going 10 minutes a day of walking reduces your risk for dementia. So we can't say it, absolutely, by 30%. That's astonishing. If that were a drug, it would be on the market tomorrow and we'd all be buying it.
Actually, I'll just add something too. So I decided when I was trying to choose my career, I job shadowed a physiotherapist and I job shadowed an occupational therapist. And so when people ask me to run, gosh, I don't want to do it, but you asked me to play basketball and away I go. So when it's integrated in our activities of daily living, the things that we do every day, like gardening or walking the dog, we sneak exercise in. And I think we don't necessarily always appreciate that. But I understand too, there's also trying to get yourself and push yourself a little bit too, right? But something is better than nothing.
Yeah, I have a statistical question that you may not be able to answer, but I'm really, really curious, and I wouldn't know how to tease this out. Several years ago, I made a decision not to go to the doctor anymore, and concomitant with that, I also made a decision not to take any pharmaceuticals. We're buried in pharmaceuticals. My question to you is, how's this going to work out for me statistically? Do you have any idea how many people? Bear with me. No, how many people in their 80s, say 85? Do you have any idea how many people who are still in reasonable health and have escaped the pharmaceutical onslaught in their 80, 85, 90, does this happen? I have no idea.
Are you exercising? You knew that was coming, right? I'd be honest, there's a researcher here, Dee Mangan, who's associated with the Tapestry study, who looks at multi-medication in older people. And there's actually a lot of data to show that the more medications that older people are on, actually the combined side effects of a lot of these things are, the burden of that is almost greater than the diseases they're trying to treat. I'm not a clinician. This is not intended as medical advice.
Neither am I. Thank you.
I just want to make mention as well that with the CLSA, as soon as data are prepared and available, we make them available to researchers. And I think that's one of the ones that people seem to be most excited about is the biomarker data. But the other one is the medication data, because we have to clean that and get it ready for researchers. But that's a big one that I think people are really excited to see. Yeah, it's coming. Yeah.
Okay, question for Brenda. I recently attended a workshop on the development of the electric and driverless car.
Yes.
And the presenter emphasized that for people who no longer can obtain a valid driver's license, this would be the answer to their problems. Now, do you know if a senior